Alrighty. Sorry about the lateness of our start here. But them's the breaks. It's just how it is. Um, Someday I'm going to rearrange my schedule in such a way that I can do these in the evening. My time. Anybody's time. Someday the schedule shift will come. Someday, etc. and so on and so forth. Okay. So where are we? Where are we? Who are we? What have we become? Good question. Good questions. Okay. Yeah, I think we're good. So welcome back to Free Read Fridays. I'm your intrepid narrator host, whatever, Fragath, and today's the final installment of Maelstrom. Let's go, right? I'm pretty excited. Uh, because that is two down and one-ish two to go. Actually, it's three down and four to go, kind of. Depends on how you count it. Because the last volume of the Rifters trilogy is actually split into two separate volumes due to publisher issues. Peter Watts will explain better, although it won't really elucidate the reason to why all that well. It's like you get the reason why, but it's dumb. It's like, oh well, actually, what you submit it to us is like we only will print books of like 180,000 words, and yours is like 190, so you have to split it into two volumes. And Peter Watts is like, okay. It is something honestly that silly. I'll read it when we get there, which is not going to be for at least a month. Um, because after this, we get started on Authority by Jeff Vandermeer. Isn't that nice? So, previously on Maelstrom, uh, mm, Lubin has had, as it turns out, a bit of an altercation with heavy metal. Um, Note to self: if you're trapped on an island in the honestly maybe not as dystopic as the current timeline we live in, future, um, don't eat the wildlife because mercury is bad for you. It's really bad. Don't do it. As Lumen has found out the hard way, which I think is one of the best gotchas ever. It's so good. It's like, oh man, Lumen is such a man. He survived. It's like, yeah, well, he did it by feeding off of the local wildlife, which, because we've done so much pollution and dumping and waste products in the ocean, it's actually probably done worse, more harm to him than Behemoth was doing at that point, which is great. Horrible, horrible, but great. Really dark, but delightfully juicy. I really shouldn't say things like that. It's too late. So he was on the case, um, trying to catch Lenny because Lenny is public enemy number one and a hazard to life on the face of the planet as we know it, which is accurate. That is what she is at this point, and she knows it. And she's starting to have inklings that maybe that's not okay. Like she's kind of getting over the fact that she's kind of getting over the fact. Well, partly because she's getting better. She's getting more well because her visions were being triggered by a combination of the fact that she, she had a very mighty brain job done on her in like a really bad way. So false memories, the whole bit, to make her think she'd been abused as a child when turns out she probably wasn't. So she's been dealing with that. She's been dealing with the fact that she was having hallucinations due to the the radical shift in pressure that she went through at the end of Starfish, which was also doing nasty things. But that paired with the brain job she'd had done really messed with her. And so she was out very much looking for vengeance, and has been pursuing that, and now is kind of like, well, what I've been doing is honestly pretty morally reprehensible, damning all of humanity and the world just because I've got a serious hate on for all the people who did this to me. Maybe I was hasty. Or maybe the cost is not worth it because it's looking like I'm not dead. I'm not dead yet, so I may actually have to live with this. Which actually I think is something she'll get to later. I have to be sure not to spoil bits of the next book because the next book, I mean, this book is a turning point. The next book is a turning point. The next book is interesting in that it's kind of like, it's really like it is a continuation of the story, but it's kind of like dealing with the aftermath in a big way and a new status quo, I guess. It's it's sort of hard to describe um, without going there because the way the two both of the volumes of the third book in the trilogy are I just lost my train of thought. Don't worry about it. Uh, they actually do work as two separate books, but like they were always meant to be a unified volume and like read it right after the other one. Which we're not going to be doing. We're going to cheat and be like, well, actually, we're going to read a Jeff Vandermeer book before we read the last one, is what we're going to do. So, previously on. Oh, right. Achilles, or Achille. I've been saying Achilles, and my reasons for that are legion. His nickname is Killjoy. That's literally my only reason. So every time I actually think about it, it's almost certainly got to be Achille and not Achilles. But it's too late now, unless somebody can get me proof positive of Peter Watts saying it's pronounced one way or the other. And I swear I read somewhere something that he wrote that indicated it was Achilles and not Achille, and he was confused as to why there was a debate. But that's probably me inventing a scenario. So, Peter Watts, if you're out there, please, just leave a comment saying it's actually pronounced this way. Oh, it's not Achilles, it's not Achille, it's Achilles. And I will be like, oh, I got to re-record the whole thing. I really should go listen to the official book on tape for Maelstrom to find out. I would assume they'd know, right? They'd know. They're being paid to get it right. I'm in a mood this morning. Don't worry about it. Let's see. It's not strictly speaking sleep deprivation. It's just recovering from stuff. Yeah. So yeah, Lenny Clark is still on the loose and at large, and Achilles Desjardins is he's about to take advantage of his newfound freedom from guilt trip. That had better not be my phone. Don't even look. Don't look. I'm not looking. Okay. So yeah, let's get cracking. Let's bang this puppy out. I shouldn't call it a puppy. Peter Watts likes cats. I don't know if he has anything against dogs. He's just a cat guy. Maybe it's Toxoplasma gondii. Who knows? This one's going to be short. I should also clarify that. So this me rambling here is entirely designed by accident to extend the duration time of the video. Also, it gives me time before I have to read, like, the F word, and the algorithm will shut me down. I've already probably shot myself in the feet. So since it's been 15 minutes, I guess that counts. What are we doing? I mean, it's not like these are monetized anyway, so I don't care. Like, I could start every stream dropping all kinds of horrible profanity, but I won't do that. I'll just read it in books. Like, here we go. Because we can afford to extend the actual read time of this a little extra. Just pad it out. Padding. That's the term I'm looking for. I'm having a whole morning. I don't want to have to read 3 pages. No, this is good enough. Random intelligence from. Oh, right. I forgot to do my bit. I'll do that. No, I'll do it now. So the image that we have here. Oh, you didn't miss anything. I'm still rambling. So you actually got here right before I'm about to actually do reading. So your timing is impeccable. Impeccable. So the Peter Watts description of this particular image is a chaotic little scribble showing Achilles Desjardins running a significant chunk of North America. I've looked high and low for a glimpse of Mandelbrot in this pic, but came up empty. I do not see Mandelbrot, who is an excellent cat. This one is done by the same person who did last week's image, Deep Space KSW. I have another Achilles Desjardins image. I'm not going to show it just yet. In fact, part of me is like, maybe I should wait until the next book where it'll be truly relevant, because, yowza! Oh, Achilles goes through some changes. You know those youths. So I'm going to read a bit from last week, and then we'll get cracking. Random intelligence from around the world scrolled on all sides. He didn't see it. Ken can head her off. Ken Lubin was guilt-tripped for tight security. Lubin kept slipping up, just so he could prove that again and again. Someone got away once, he'd said, and then, it's a shame, she really deserved a fighting chance. Lenny Clark had had more than a fighting chance. She had legions of followers watching her back. But they'd never really been following her. They'd been chasing some blue-shifted evolutionary distortion, racing past at light speed. Unless an enemy knew where she was and sounded the alarm, and whatever else it was, Anemone was no clairvoyant. How would anyone even know about the lone black figure crawling past them in the night? Lenny Clark was just one woman, and Ken Lubin was hunting her down. There was no great need to kill her. She could be cleansed. She could be neutralized without being erased. But that didn't matter, not to Lubin. She's the only security breach he ever left unsealed. That's what he said. Achilles Desjardins had never met Lenny Clark. By rights, she should be one of the far-off millions. And yet, somehow, he knew her. Someone driven entirely by other people's motives. Everything she did, everything she felt, was the result of surgical and biochemical lies placed within her for the service of others. Oh yes, I know her all right. Suddenly, the fact that she was also a vector for global apocalypse barely even mattered anymore. Lenny Clark had a face. He could feel her in his gut, another human being far more real than the distant abstraction of an 8-digit death toll. I'm going to get to her first. Sure, Lubin was a trained killer, but Desjardins had his own set of enhancements. All lawbreakers did. His system was awash in chemicals that could crank his reflexes into overdrive in an instant. And with luck, if he moved fast enough, he might just beat Lubin to the target. He might, just barely, have half a chance. It wasn't his job. It wasn't the greater good. Fuck both those things. So Achilles is, we're not really going to see Achilles truly unleashed, but he is slipping the fetters, shall we say. Shall we say, he said most pretentiously. Slipping the fetters, yes, indeed. Cheerio. I'll stop that. That's really, really crass. Where, so I can find it, is the other image. I'm not going to put it up yet. Okay, so the image you're seeing right now is from 2021. The other one will be from earlier, which will explain some of the text. Okay. So now, without further ado, the final installment, followed by afterword, well, epilogue, afterward, okay. So the final installment, followed by epilogue, acknowledgments, and references. I think I put afterward in the stream description. Whoopsie! I'm not going to read the footnotes because they are all actual literary references. I'm going to double check them real quick to see if any of them are jokey ones, like he did for Blind Sight. They do not immediately appear to be. I don't see anything like 2038 as a date or year of publication, so we're fine. I think Echopraxia does the same thing, where there's a couple joke references in there, but you know they're there once you know they're there. Or, well, actually, that's going to get real confusing once we get to like 2050 or so, and we're like, oh wait, wait a minute, is that real? Because people will have forgotten to look at the front of the book to see when a book was published, because we won't have books anymore. Before I get further morose, let's just get this bagged out, okay? AWOL. There's been a breach, the corpse said. We were hoping you could fill in some relevant details. Half of Alice Jovellanos' facial muscles tried to go into spasm right there. She clamped a tight lid on their aspirations and presented what she hoped was a look of, oh, please God, let it be innocent and oh, whoops. Oh, okay. I see what he did there. Whoops. Half of Alice Jovellanos' facial muscles tried to go into spasm right there. She clamped a tight lid on their aspirations and presented what she hoped was a look of, oh, please God, let it be, innocent and concerned curiosity. Then again, what's the point? Whispered some smart-ass inner voice. They must know already. Why else would they even call you in? She clamped down on that one, too. They're just toying with you. No one gets to be a corpse without developing a taste for sadism. And that, just barely. There were 4 of them, gender-balanced, ringed around the far side of the conference table up in the stratosphere of Admin 14. Sliper, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, Slijper, Sliper? Sliper was the only one Jovellanos recognized. She'd just been brought in as Lertzmann's replacement. The corpses all sat arrayed on the far side of the table, backlit by little halogen spots, their faces lost in the shadow of that glare. Except for the eyes. All 4 sets of eyes twinkled intermittently with corporate intel. They'd be monitoring her vitals, of course. They'd know she was stressed. Of course, anyone would be stressed under these conditions. Hopefully, subtleties like guilt and innocence were beyond the scope of the remotes.
"You're aware of the recent attack on Don Lertzmann?"
Sliper said. Jovellanos nodded.
"We think it may have been connected with a colleague of yours, Achilles Desjardins."
Okay, just the right amount of surprise here. Achilles? Why?
We were hoping you could tell
us, one of the other corpses replied.
But I don't know any. I mean, why not ask him directly? They already have, you idiot. That's what's led them to you. He sold you out. After all this, disappeared,
Sliper finished. Jovellanos straightened in her chair. Excuse me?
I said Dr. Desjardins seems to have gone AWOL. When he didn't show up for his shift, we were concerned that he might have run into the same complications as Dawn, but the evidence suggests he disappeared of his own volition.
Evidence?
He wants you to feed his cat,
Sliper said. What do... Sliper held up one hand.
I know, and I hope you'll forgive the intrusion. He left the message on your cue. He said he didn't know how long he was going to be gone, but he'd be grateful if you took care of... Mandelbrot, is it? And he'd keyed the door to let you in. At any rate, the hand dropped back below table level. This kind of behavior is frankly unprecedented from anyone on the trip. He seems to have simply abandoned his post, with no apology, no explanation, no advance warning. It's impulsive, to say the least.
Oh, man. Killjoy, you were covered. Why'd you have to blow it? I didn't know that was even possible, Jovellanos said. He had his shots years ago.
Nonetheless, here we are.
Sliper leaned back in her chair.
We were wondering if you had noticed anything unusual in his behavior lately. Anything which, looking back, might have suggested...
No, nothing. Although... Jovellanos took a breath. Actually, he has been kind of, withdrawn lately. Well, it's true enough, and they probably know already. It'd look suspicious if I didn't mention it. Any idea why? Asked another corpse. Not really, she shrugged. I've seen it happen before. It's bound to wear on you, having to deal with high-level crises all the time. And trip people can't always talk about what's on their minds, so I just let them be.
Please, please, please don't let them have high-level telemetry on me now. I see, Sliper said. Well, thank you anyway, Dr. Jovellanos.
Is that all? She started to rise. Not quite, said one of the other corpses. There's one other thing. Concerning, oh, please, no, your own involvement in all this. Jovellanos slumped back into her chair and waited for the axe to fall. Dr. Desjardins' disappearance leaves, well, a vacancy we really can't afford at this time, the corpse continued. Jovellanos looked at the backlit tribunal. A tiny part of her dared to hope.
You worked closely with him through a great deal of this. We understand that your own contribution to date hasn't been negligible. In fact, you've been working below your own potential for some time now, and you're certainly further up the learning curve than anyone else we could bring in at this point. On the usual scales, you're overdue for a promotion. But apparently, that is, according to Psych, you have certain objections to taking Guilt Trip.
I can't believe it,
Now, please understand, we don't hold this against you, said the corpse. Your issues concerning invasive technology are very understandable after what happened to your brother. I can't honestly say I'd feel any differently in your shoes. That whole nanotech thing was such a debacle.
A sudden familiar lump rose in Jovellanos' throat.
So, you see, we understand your objections, but perhaps you could understand that Guilt Trip hails from a whole different arena. There's certainly nothing dangerous.
I do know the difference between bio and nano, Jovellanos said mildly.
Yes, of course, I didn't mean to.
It's just that what happened to Cheeto, logic doesn't always enter into it when you Cheeto. Poor, dead, tortured Cheeto. These haploids don't have the slightest clue the things I've done. All for you, kiddo.
Yes, we understand that, of course. And even though your prejudice, again, entirely understandable, even though it's held you back professionally, you've proven to be an exceptional performer. The question is, after all these years, will you continue to be held back?
Because we all think that would be a shame, Sliper said. Jovellanos looked across the table and said nothing for a full 10 seconds. Mississippi 1. Mississippi 10. I think maybe it's time to let go, she said at last. So you'd be willing to get your shots and move up to senior lawbreaker, Sliper said. For you, Cheeto. Onward and upward. Alice Jovellanos nodded gravely, stoically refusing to let her facial muscles do a whole different kind of dance. I think I'd be up for that. So Alice Jovellanos moving up the corporate ladder. Go, girl! For the record, it's not Cheeto. I figured that was hopefully obvious that nobody is named after a junk food product, and I probably mispronounced Chito. Cheeto. Scheherazade. Fossil water, cold and gray. She remembered the local lore, although she was no longer certain how she'd learned it. Less than 1% of the lakes, capital L, hailed from runoff or rainfall. She swam through the liquid remains of a glacier that had melted 10,000 years before. It would never refill once human appetites had drained it dry. For now, there was more than enough to cover her passage. For days, the mermaid had passed through its depths. Visions of a past she couldn't remember rose like bubbles through the dark water and the pain in her side. She'd long since stopped trying to deny them. At night she would rise like some oversized plankter. She couldn't risk coming ashore, but she'd stocked her pack with freeze-dried rations in Chicago. She'd float on the surface and tear into the vacuum-sealed pouches like a sea otter, resubmerging before dawn. She thought she remembered part of a childhood, spent where the three greatest lakes converged. Sault Sainte Marie. Sault Sainte Marie. Commercial bottleneck into Lake Superior. If I'm mispronouncing that, please tell me. I need to know. I take criticism sometimes. The city sat on its locks and dams like a troll at a bridge, extorting levies from passing tonnage. It wasn't as populous now as it had been, 400 kilometers from the edge of the sovereign Quebec, but still too close for some, especially in the wake of the Nunavut lease. A giant's shadow is a cold place to live at the best of times. A giant grown invincible overnight, nursing grudges from an oppressed childhood, was a complete non-starter. So people had left. Lenny Clark remembered leaving. She'd had a whole lot of first-hand experience with shadows, and giants, and unhappy childhoods. So she, too, had moved away, and kept moving until the Pacific Ocean had stood in her way and said, "No farther." She'd settled in Vancouver and lived day to day, year to year, until that moment when the grid authority had turned her into something that even the ocean couldn't stop. Now she was back. Past midnight. The mermaid cut quietly through the surface, squirming with... The mermaid cut quietly through a surface, squirming with reflected metropolitan light. The walls of a distant lift lock huddled against the western sky like a low fortress, holding back the elevated waters of Lake Superior. One relic, at least, still resisting depletion. Clark kept the lock to her left, swam north to the Canadian side. Derelict wharves had been rotting there since before she'd been born. She split her hood and filled her chest with air. She left her fins behind. Even with night eyes, there was no one else to be seen. She walked north to Queen and turned east, her feet following their own innate path beneath the dim streetlights. No one and nothing accosted her. Eastbourne Manor continued to rot undemolished, although someone had swept away the cardboard prefabs in the past 20 years. At Coulson she stopped, looking north. The house she remembered was still there, just up from the corner. Odd how little it had changed in 2 decades. Assuming, of course, that those memories hadn't been acquired more recently. She still hadn't seen a single vehicle or another human being. Farther east, though, on the far side of Riverview, there was no mistaking the line of hovering botflies. She turned her back the way she'd come. There, too. They'd moved in behind her without a sound. She turned up Coulson. The door recognized her after all that time. It opened like a mouth, but the inside lights, as if knowing she'd have no need of their services, remained off. The front hall receded in front of her, barren and unfurnished. Its walls glistened strangely, as if freshly lacquered. An archway cut into the left wall, the living room where Indira Clark used to sit and do nothing. Past that, the staircase, an empty gray throat leading up into hell. She wouldn't be going up there just yet. She sighed and turned the corner into the living room. "Ken," she said. The living room, too, was an unfurnished shell. The windows had been blacked out, but the faint streetlight leaking in through the hall was more than enough for rifter vision. Lubin stood in the middle of that stark space. He wore dryback clothes, but his eyes were capped. Just behind him, the room's only furniture, a chair with a man tied into it. He appeared to be merely unconscious. "You shouldn't have come," Lubin said. "Where else was I going to go?" Lubin shook his head. He seemed suddenly agitated. "It was a stupid move, easy to anticipate. You must have known that." "Where else was there?" she asked again. "This isn't even what you think it is. This isn't what you remember." "I know," said Clark. Lubin looked at her, frowning. They fucked me over, Ken. I know that. I guess I knew it ever since I started having the visions, although it took me a while to...
Then why did you come here?
Ken Lubin was nowhere... Oh, wait, no. Whoops.
Then why did you come here?
Ken Lubin was nowhere to be found. This thing in his place seemed almost human. I must have had a real childhood somewhere, Clark said after a moment. They can't have faked all of it. This seemed like the best place to start looking.
And you think they'll let you? You think I can let you?
She looked at him. His flat, empty eyes looked back from a face in unexpected torment. I guess not, she sighed at last. But you know something, Ken? It was almost worth it. Just learning this much. Knowing what they did to me. Behind Lubin, the man in the chair stirred briefly. So, what happens now? Clark asked. You kill me for playing Typhoid Mary? They need me as a lab rat?
I don't know how much that matters anymore. It's all over the place now.
What kind of plague is this, anyway? With mild surprise, she noted the weakness of her own curiosity. I mean, it's been almost a year and I'm not dead. I don't even have any symptoms.
Takes longer with rifters, Lubin said. And it's not even a disease, strictly speaking. More of a soil nanobe. Locks up sulfates or something.
That's it? Clark shook her head. I let all those losers fuck me and it's not even going to kill them?
It'll kill most everyone, Lubin said softly. It's just gonna take a while.
Oh. She tried to summon some sort of reaction to that news, some gut-level feeling of appropriate scale. She was still trying when Lubin said,
You gave us a good run, anyway. No one can believe you got as far as you did.
I had help, Clark said.
You heard.
I heard a lot of things, Clark told him. I don't know what to make of it. I don't know what to make of any of it. I do, said the man in the chair. I'm sorry, Lenny, the man said. I tried to stop him. I don't know you. Clark looked back at Lubin. He did? Lubin nodded. But he's still alive.
I didn't even break anything.
Wow. She looked back at the bound man. So, who is he?
Guy called Achilles Desjardins, Lubin said. Lawbreaker with the Entropy Patrol. Big fan of yours, actually.
Yeah? Why is he tied up like that?
For the greater good.
She wondered briefly whether to pursue it. Instead, she turned to Desjardins, squatted down in front of him. You actually tried to stop him? Desjardins nodded. For me? Sort of. Not exactly, he said. It's kind of hard to explain. He wriggled against the elastic filaments binding him to the chair. They tightened visibly in response. Think maybe you could cut me loose? She glanced over her shoulder. Lubin stared back in shades of gray. I don't think so, she said. Not yet. Probably not ever. Come on, you don't need his permission, Desjardins said. You can see? It should have been too dark for mortal eyes to have registered her movements.
He's a lawbreaker, Lubin reminded her.
So what?
Enhanced pattern matching. He doesn't actually see any better than your average dryback, but he's better at interpolating weak input.
Clark turned back to Desjardins, leaned close. You said you knew me. Yeah, he said. Tell me, she whispered. Look, this is not the time. Your friend is seriously unbalanced, and in case you haven't figured it out yet, we are both... Actually, Clark said, I don't think Ken's himself today, or we'd both be dead already. Desjardins shook his head and swallowed. Okay, then, Clark said. Do you know the story of Scheherazade? Do you remember why she told her stories? Oh, Jesus, Desjardins said weakly. The mermaid smiled. Tell us a story, Achilles. Adaptive shatter. Lubin listened while Desjardins laid it out. The lawbreaker had obviously been reading up since their last encounter. The first mutations must have been really simple, he was saying. The gels were trying to spread Behemoth, and this Lenny Clark variable had been tagged as a carrier in some personnel file. So any bug that had your name in its source would have had an edge, at least to start with. The gels would think it was important information, so they'd let it pass. And even when they caught on and even when they'd caught on, whoops. Oh, I see. It's a run-on sentence. And even when they caught on, that'd just pressure the wildlife to come up with something new. And wildlife's way faster than meat. We're like ice ages and continental drift to them. We drive their evolution, but we're slow. They've got all the time they need to come up with countermeasures. So now a bunch of them have gone symbiotic, some kind of Lenny Clark interdiction network, in exchange for protection from the gels. It's like being a mackerel with a bunch of sharks for bodyguards. It's a huge competitive edge. So everyone's jumping on the bandwagon. He looked through the darkness at Clark. You really catalyzed something amazing, you know. Group selection's rare enough, but you actually inspired a bunch of separate life forms to make, well, a colonial superorganism, really. Individuals acting as body parts. Some of them don't do anything but shuttle messages around like living neurotransmitters, I guess. Whole lineages evolved just to handle conversation with humans. That's why nobody could track the fucker down. They were all looking for Turing apps and neural net code, and there wasn't any. It was all genetic. Nobody made the connection. He fell silent. No, Clark shook her head. That doesn't explain anything. She'd grown far too still during his recitation. It explains everything, Desjardins said. So I'm just some kind of password? Is that it? She leaned in close. Just a key to get through those fucking head cheeses. What about Yankton, you fucker? What about that apocalypse mermaid shit? And all those people with their fake eye caps trying to suck me dry every time I turn around? Where'd they come from? Same thing, Desjardins stammered. An enemy was just spreading the meme any way it could. Not good enough. Say something else. But I don't say something else. It happens all the time, for Christ's sakes. People strap bombs onto their backs, or they release sarin in the passenger lounge, or they go to school one day and just start shooting, and they know they're gonna die, but it's worth it, you know? As long as they get the bastards who victimized them. She laughed, a staccato bark, the sound of something snapping. That's what I am in all this? A victim? Desjardins shook his head. They're the victims. You're just the gun they used to fight back with. She glared down at him. He looked back, helpless. She hit him in the face. Desjardins toppled backward. The back of his head hit the floor with a crack. He lay there, tied to the overturned chair, moaning. She turned. Lubin was blocking the exit. She faced him for a few seconds, unmoving. If you're going to kill me, she said at last, just do it. Either that or get out of my way. He considered a moment. He stepped aside. Lenny Clark brushed past him and went upstairs. She really had spent her childhood here, of course. The sets were real enough. It was only the supporting roles that had been imaginary. Lubin knew exactly where she was going. He found her in the undarkness of her old bedroom. It had been stripped and sprayed, like the rest of the house. Clark turned at his entrance, looked around tiredly at the bare walls. So, is it abandoned? On the market? We did this before you arrived, he said, just in case, to simplify cleanup. Well, it doesn't matter. Still seems like yesterday, in fact. She aimed her capped eyes at one wall. That's where my bed was. That was where Dad used to play bedtime stories for me. Foreplay, I guess you'd call it. And there's the air duct, gesturing at a grill set into the baseboard, that connects right down to the living room. I could hear Mom playing with her favorite shows. I always thought those shows were really stupid, but looking back, maybe she didn't like them much, or maybe she didn't like them much either. They were just alibis. It didn't happen, Lubin reminded her. None of it. I know that, Ken. I get the point. She took a breath. And you know, right now, I think I'd give anything if it had. Lubin blinked, surprised. What? She turned to face him. Do you have any idea what it's like to be haunted by happiness? She managed a bitter laugh. All those months I kept denying it, chalking it up to stroke and hallucination because shit, Ken, I couldn't have had a happy childhood. My parents couldn't be anything but monsters, you see. The monsters made me what I am. They're the only reason I survived all the shit that came later. They're the only thing that kept me going. I was not gonna let those stump fucks win. Everything that drove me, every time I didn't quit, every time I beat the odds, it was a slap in their big, smug, all-powerful monster faces. Everything I ever did, I did against them. Everything I am is against them. And now you stand there and tell me the monsters never even existed. Her eyes were hard, empty spots of rage. She glared up at him, her shoulders shaking. But finally she turned away, and when she spoke again, her voice came out soft and broken. They do exist, Ken. Honest to God, flesh and blood monsters, the old-fashioned kind. They hide from the daylight, and they sneak out of the swamps at night, and they go on rampages, just like you'd expect. A long, shuddering breath. And all these monsters could ever say in their own defense is it happened to them first. The world fucked them long before they started fucking it back. And if anyone out there wasn't guilty, well, they hadn't stopped all the others who were, right? Somebody's got it coming. But the monsters can't plead self-defense. They can't even plead righteous revenge. Nothing happened to them. Something happened, Lubin said, even if your parents didn't do it. She didn't speak for a while. Then, I wonder what he was like, really. From what I've heard, Lubin said, he was just a typical dad. Do you know where he is? Where they are? They died 12 years ago. Tularemia. Of course. A soft laugh. I guess that was one of my qualifications, right? No loose ends. He stepped around her, watched her face come into view. It was wet. Lubin paused, taken aback. He'd never known Lenny Clark to cry before. Her capped eyes met his, A corner of her mouth twitched in something like a rueful grin. At least, if you were right about Behemoth, the real culprits are in for it along with everyone else. She shook her head. It's the weirdest thing I've ever heard. I'm some killer asteroid in the sky, and the dinosaurs are actually cheering for me. Just the little ones. She looked at him. Ken, I think maybe I've destroyed the world. It wasn't you. Right. An enemy. I was just a mule for an artificial stupidity, I guess you'd call it. She shook her head. If you believe that guy downstairs. It's an old story, Lubin reflected. Body snatchers. Things that get inside you and make you do things you'd never do, given the... He stopped. Clark was watching him with a strange expression. Like your conditioned reflex, she said quietly. Your security breaches. He swallowed. Does it ever haunt you, Ken? All the people you've killed?
There's an antidote, he admitted. Sort of a chaser for guilt trip. Makes things easier to live with.
Absolution, she whispered.
You've heard of it?
In fact, he'd never found it necessary. Saw some graffiti down in the dust belt, Clark said. They were trying to wash it off, but there must have been something in the ink. She stepped toward the hallway. Lubin turned to follow. Faint machine sounds and the soft hissing of fluids drifted in from outdoors. What's going on out there, Ken?
Decontamination. We evacuated the area before you arrived.
Gonna fry the neighborhood? Another step. Clark was in the doorway.
No, we know your route. Behemoth hasn't had a chance to spread from there, even if you left any behind.
That's not likely, I take it.
You're not bleeding. You didn't piss or shit anywhere since you came ashore.
She was in the hall, at the top of the stairs. Lubin moved to her side. You're just being extra careful, Clark said.
That's right.
It's kind of pointless, though, isn't it?
What?
She turned to face him. I've crossed a continent, Ken. I was on the Strip for weeks. I hung out in the Belt. I just spent a week swimming through the drinking water for 500 million people. I bled and fucked and shat and pissed more times than you can count, in oceans and toilets and half the ditches in between. Maybe you did too, although I guess they've cleaned you up since then. So, really, what's the point? He shrugged.
It's all we can do. Watch for brush fires, hope to put them out before they get too big.
And keep me from starting new ones. He nodded. You can't sterilize an ocean, she said. You can't sterilize a whole continent.
Maybe we can, he thought.
The sounds of decontamination were louder here, but not much. Even the occasional voice was hushed, almost as if the neighborhood was still infested with innocents, as though the crews feared sleeping citizens who could wake at any moment and catch them red-handed. You never answered me before, Ken. Lenny Clark took a step down the stairs. About whether you were going to kill me.
She's not going to run, he told himself. You know her. She's already taken her best shot. She's not... You don't have to...
Well, I guess we'll find out, she said, and started calmly down the stairs.
Lenny.
She didn't look back. He followed her down. Surely she didn't think she could outrun him. Surely she didn't think...
You know I can't just let you leave,
he said behind her. Of course she knows. You know what she's doing. She was at the foot of the stairs. The open door gaped 5 meters in front of her. Something deformed suddenly in Lubin's gut. It almost seemed like guilt trip, but she was almost to the door. Something with halogen eyes was spraying the sidewalk beyond. Lubin moved without thinking. In an instant he'd blocked the doorway. In another he'd closed and locked the door itself, plunging the house into darkness even by Rifter standards. "Hey!" Desjardins complained from the living room. A few photons sneaked around the edges of the door. Lenny Clark was a vague silhouette by that feeble light. Lubin felt his fists clenching, unclenching. No matter how he tried, he couldn't make them stop.
Listen, he managed to say, I really don't have any choice.
I know, Ken, she said softly. It's okay.
I don't,
he said again, almost whimpering.
Sure you do,
boomed a strange voice in his ear. Bam, bam, bam with the dramatic twists.
It's an ensemble cast, ladies and gentlemen. Who's next? Shadow? Shadow, get back here. Get back on stage here, buddy. It's your encore.
What was... Alice? Came Desjardins' voice from around the corner. Sorry, let me put a hand in front of my mouth.
Alice?
There we go, that's better.
You're a free agent, Kenny boy, the voice said. You don't have to do anything you don't want to. Take my word for it.
Lubin tapped the bead in his ear.
Identify yourself. Alice Roviano, senior lawbreaker, Sudbury franchise. At your service.
No shit.
No shit.
Drifted from the living room. I'll get it right eventually, because it's a perfect comedy setup, but it's Peter Watts, so you're not sure if you should laugh. Sorry.
No shit. No shit.
It's no, then italicized shit. So,
no shit.
There we go. That's better. I've said no shit 12 times now. Drifted from the living room. Lubin tapped his bead again.
We've got a breach on communications. Someone going by Alice Jovellanos.
They already know, big man. They were the ones who patched me through in the first place. I gave them the rest of the night off. Lenny Clark stepped back from Lubin, turned toward the darkened living room.
What? This is a restricted channel, Lubin said. Get off.
Fuck that. I outrank you.
I gather you haven't been on the job very long.
Long enough.
Killjoy, is Lenny Clark there?
Yeah.
Yeah? Yeah?
Desjardins said.
Alice, what?
She got a watch? I've got Lubin's channel and your inlays. Boy, I can't wait until they slide a set of those into my head. But nothing on Lenny.
Lenny,
Desjardins said.
Hold your watch away from your body.
Don't have one, the dark shape said. Too bad, Jovellanos said. Lubin, I wasn't kidding. You're a free man.
I don't believe you, Lubin said.
Killjoy's free. Why not you as well?
We never met. No opportunity.
But he was back beneath the waves in Lake Michigan, not killing Lenny Clark. He was in debriefing afterward, pretending he'd never had the chance. It's an infection, Jovellanos said. Real subversive. We made sure it was airborne, packed it inside an encephalitis jacket, although you'll be relieved to know, though the... Okay, let's take that from the top. Sorry. Perils of doing this live. We don't get every line right. I gotta have less between-line commentary. Oh well. It's an infection, Jovellanos said. Real subversive. We made sure it was airborne, packed it inside an encephalitis jacket, although you'll be relieved to know the contents aren't quite so lethal. It's spraying through Xira even as we speak. All he had to do was open the door. Even if this Jovellanos wasn't lying about ordering the crew to stand down, they wouldn't have had time to pack up yet. Someone could just tap an icon and Alice Jovellanos would be jammed. Another, she'd be traced. The situation wasn't even close to out of control. He could afford a few moments. The trip's been weakening in you ever since you shared air with Killjoy there, Jovellanos was saying. You're calling your own shots now, Ken. Kinda changes things, doesn't it?
Alice, are you completely...
Desjardins sounded almost in tears.
That's the only lease he ever had!
Actually, that's not true. Ken Lubin's one of the most moral men you could ever meet.
For God's sake, Alice! I'm fucking tied to a chair with my face caved in!
Trust me, I'm looking at his medical records right now. No serotonin or tryptophan deprivation, no TPH polymorphisms. He may not be a fun date, but he's no impulse killer. Which is not to say that you don't have a few issues, Ken. Am I right? How did you... But of course she'd been able to access his files, Lubin realized. It was just that any normal lawbreaker wouldn't be able to justify such an intrusion to Guilt Trip, not in the course of a normal assignment. She actually did it somehow. She freed me. He felt like throwing up. What was it like all those years, Ken? Jovellanos purred in his ear, knowing she'd got away with it? All those nifty childhood experiences that made you so right for the job? Of course you thought about revenge. You spent your whole life fantasizing about revenge, didn't you? Anyone would have. What am I going to do? You say it's an infection, he said, trying to deflect her. But you never once acted on it, did you, Ken? Because you're a moral man, and you knew that would be wrong. How does it work? Don't respond. Don't let her play you. Keep on target. And when the slip-ups started, those were just mistakes, right? Inadvertent little breaches that had to be sealed. You killed Van, of course, but there wasn't any choice. You always played by the rules, and it wasn't your fault, was it? The trip made you do it. Answer me. No. Control. Relax. Don't let her hear it. Only it started happening so often, and people had to wonder if you hadn't found some way to have your cake and eat it too. That's why they sent you someplace where there weren't any security issues or mission priorities that could set you off. They didn't want to give you a choice, so they sent you someplace you wouldn't have an excuse. His respiration rate was far too high. He concentrated on bringing it down. A few steps away, Clark's silhouette seemed dangerously attentive. You're still a moral man, Ken, Jovellanos said. You follow the rules. You won't kill unless you don't have a choice. I'm telling you, you've got a choice. Your infection, he grated. What does it do? Liberates slaves. Bullshit answer. But at least she was out of his head. How? He pressed. Complexes guilt trip into an inactive form that binds to the Minsky receptors. Doesn't affect anyone who isn't already tripped. What about side effects? He said. Side effects? Baseline guilt, for example? Baseline guilt, for example, Lubin said. Desjardins moaned.
Oh, shit. Of course. Of course.
What's going on? Clark said. What are you talking about? Lubin almost laughed aloud. Regular garden variety guilt. Plain old conscience. How would they ever get into play now that their receptor sites had been jammed? Jovellanos and her buddies had been so busy tweaking the synthetics that they'd forgotten about chemicals that had been there for eons. Except they hadn't forgotten. They'd known exactly what they were doing. Lubin was sure of it. All hail the Entropy Patrol. The power to shut down cities and governments. The power to save 1,000,000 people here or kill 1,000,000 somewhere else. The power to keep everything going or to tear it all to shreds overnight. He turned to Clark. Your fan club's been throwing off the shackles of oppression, he said. They're free now. Not slaves to guilt trip, not slaves to guilt. Untouchable by conscience in any form. He raised a hand in the darkness, a bitter toast. Congratulations, Dr. Jovellanos. There's only a few thousand people with their hands on all the world's kill switches, and you've turned them all into clinical sociopaths.
Dun, 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 dun.
Believe me, Jovellanos said, you'll hardly notice the difference. Desjardins was noticing, though.
Shit. Shit. I wouldn't even be here. I mean, I just picked up and left. I threw everything away. Didn't care about the world going to pieces. I just, for one person, just because I wanted to.
Remember, he's in the room. He's on the floor. So we're trying to muffle him. We psychos are notorious for bad impulse control, Clark said, approaching him. Ken, how do you spring these bindings? Lubin glowered at her back. Doesn't she get it? Come on, Ken. The situation's contained. None of us is going anywhere for the time being, and any rules we were playing by before seem to have pretty much gone out the window. Maybe we could start working together for a change. He hesitated. Nothing she said raised any kind of alarm in his gut. Nothing urged him into action. No other presence tried to take control of his motor nerves. Almost experimentally, he crossed into the living room and depolarized the tangle threads. They slipped to the floor like overcooked pasta. For good measure, he pulled a light stick from his pocket and struck it. Light flared in the gutted room. Desjardins blinked over shrinking pupils and gingerly explored the bruise on his cheek. Conscience is overrated anyway, Jovellanos said all around them. Give it a rest, Alice, Desjardins said, rubbing his wrists. I'm serious. Think about it. Not everyone even has a conscience, and the people that do are invariably exploited by the ones that don't. Conscience is irrational when you get right down to it. You are so full of shit. Sociopathy doesn't make you a killer. It just means you aren't restrained from being one if the situation calls for it. Hey, Killjoy, you could think of it as a kind of liberation. The lawbreaker snorted. Come on, Q. I'm right. You know there's at least a chance I'm right. What I know is that the most I can hope for is to be out of a job right up until the world ends, if I'm not dead 10 minutes from now. You know, Jovellanos said, I may even be able to do something about that. Desjardins said nothing. What's that, Killjoy? Suddenly you're not telling me to fuck off? Keep talking, he said. She did. Lubin pulled the bead out of his ear and stood up. The light stick threw his shadow huge and ominous across the room. Lenny Clark sat with her back propped against the far wall. Lubin's silhouette swallowed her whole. I could kill her in an instant, he thought, and marveled at how absurd the thought seemed. She looked up as he approached. I hate it here, she said softly. I know. He leaned his back against the wall, slid down at her side. This isn't home, she continued. There's only one place that was ever home. 3,000 meters below the surface of the Pacific. A beautiful, dark universe filled with monsters and wonders that didn't even exist anymore. What is home, really? It was Desjardins who had spoken. Lubin looked back at him. Alice has been doing a little snooping down avenues a bit more political than I ever really bothered with. Desjardins tapped the side of his head. She came up with some interesting shipping news, and it raises the question, what's home? Where your heart is, or where your parents are? Lubin looked at Lenny Clark. She looked back. Neither spoke. Ah, well, doesn't really matter, Desjardins said. Turns out, you may be able to go back, either way. A niche. The mid-Atlantic ridge was a shitty place to raise one's kids, Patricia Rowan reflected. Not that there'd been many options, of course. In point of fact, there had been three. Build an onshore refuge and trust conventional quarantine technology, escape into high orbit, or withdraw behind the same cold, heavy barrier that had shielded the Earth for 4 billion years before Enumpak had punched a hole in the global condom. They'd done the analyses from every angle. The off-world option was least cost-effective and most vulnerable to acts of groundside retribution. Orbital stations weren't exactly inconspicuous targets, and it was a fair bet that at least some of those left behind would be ungracious enough to lob a vindictive nuke or two up the well. And if groundside quarantine tech had been up to the job, they wouldn't have been in this situation in the first place. That option must have been on the table only to accommodate a bureaucratic obsession with the completest detail. Or maybe as some kind of sick joke. There had been a fourth option. They could have stayed behind and faced Behemoth with the rest of the world. They'd undergone the necessary retrofits, after all. Even if they'd stayed on shore, there would have been none of the disintegration that was in store for everyone else. Not for them, the lost hair and fingernails, the oozing sores, the limbs coming apart at the joints. No blindness, no ulcers, no short-circuit seizures as insulation frayed from nervous circuitry. No organs reduced to mush. None of the thousand opportunistic diseases usually listed as proximate causes of death. They could have stayed and watched it happen to everyone else, and synthesized their food from raw elements once the biosphere itself was lost. That option hadn't received a whole lot of discussion, though. We're not even running from Behemoth. We're running from our own citizens. All of Atlantis knew that, even if nobody talked about it. They'd seen the mobs from their penthouses, seen civil unrest graphed against time on exponential curves. Behemoth, coupled with the Clark meme, a big enough threat, a sufficiently compelling role model, and revolution was suddenly a lot closer than the usual 3 meals away. We were lucky to get out in time, Rowan reflected. But they had. And here they were, several hundred corpses, essential support personnel, families, and assorted hangers-on, termites dug in 3 kilometers down in a jumbled cluster of titanium/fullerene spheres, safely distant from the world outside, invisible to all but those with the very best technological eyes, the very best intel. It was an acceptable risk. Most of those people were already down here. There was lots of headroom. There were 2 gymnasiums, half a dozen greenhouses, and gardens thoughtfully distributed with an eye to redundancy in the unlikely event of a local implosion. Vats of acephalic organ cloners, vats of acephalic organ cloners with elongate telomeres. 3 power plants that fed from a small geothermal vent, certified Behemoth-free, of course. A nice, safe 1,200 meters on the far side of an interpositioned ridge. And somewhere out on that basalt escarpment lay a veritable junkyard of unassembled components, fragments of libraries and playgrounds and community centers, all squirreled away against some future less constrained by the need for speedy cowardice. In the meantime, Rowan had heard many residents of Atlantis complain about crowding. She felt somewhat less imposed upon than most. She'd seen the specks on the rifter stations. It was after midnight. The corridor lights were dimmed in some pale parody of a sunlit existence. Most of the inhabitants, excepting the facade, had withdrawn into their apartments. Rowan's own husband and children were asleep. For some reason, though, she couldn't bring herself to go along with the pretense. What was the point? Natural sleep cycles wander all over the clock without a photoperiod to calibrate the hypothalamus. There was no sunlight here. They would never see sunlight again. Let it go, let it go. But this is temporary, they say. Something will beat Behemoth, or somehow we'll learn to live with it. This deep, dark pit is only a refuge, not a destiny. We'll be back, we'll be back, we'll be back. Sure. Sometimes, if she tried very hard, she could almost blind herself to the strings and teetering struts that kept those hopeful dreams from collapsing. Usually it was too much trouble, and she'd wander for hours along the empty twilit corridors in defiance of her own nostalgia. As she wandered now. Sometimes she passed windows and paused. Something else Atlantis had that the Rifters hadn't. Clear parabolic blisters shaped to actually draw strength from the crushing pressure. The view was nothing to write home about, of course. A lozenge of gray bedrock, reflecting dim light from the viewport. Occasional blinking stars, beacons endlessly flashing, "Here there be power lines," or "Construction stockpile." Very rarely, a rat tail or some other unremarkable creature. No monsters. Nothing remotely like the ravenous, glowing predators that had once plagued the Rifters at BB Station. Mostly just solid, unrelieved blackness. Sometimes Rowan would stare into that sightless void and lose track of time. Once or twice she even thought she'd glimpsed something looking back. Her imagination, perhaps. Her own reflection, thrown back from some unexpected curve in the teardrop perspex. Maybe even her conscience. She could always hope. A nexus ahead, a dim space where several corridors converged like the arms of a starfish. A choice to be made. Turning left would keep her on the perimeter. All other roads led inward, to control centers, to lounges, to hollow ganglia where people accumulated even when the lights were down. Patricia Rowan had no wish for company. She stepped left. And stopped. An apparition stood before her in the corridor, a dark wraith with empty eyes. Sea water trickled down its skin, left small puddled footprints on the floor behind. The figure was female. She was as black as an ocean. The wraith reached up and split her face open. "Hi, Mom," she said. "Lenny Clark." Rowan breathed the words. "You left the door unlocked," Clark said. "I let myself in. Hope you don't mind." Call for help, Rowan thought. She didn't move. Clark glanced around the corridor. "Nice place. Very spacious." A cold, empty look at Rowan. "You got a great deal on this. You should have seen the dump we were in." "Call for help. She's alone. She's—" "Don't be an idiot. She didn't get into the middle of the Atlantic Ocean by herself." "How did you find us?" Rowan said, and was relieved. Whoops. "How did you find us?" Rowan said, and was relieved to hear dispassion in her voice. "Are you kidding? You have any idea how many resources you people had to allocate to set this place up? And on such a tight schedule, too. Did you really think you'd be able to cover your tracks?" Most of them, Rowan admitted. You'd have to be a lawbreaker to... Desjardins. But we cancelled his access. Yeah, those crazy lawbreakers. Clark shook her head. You know, they're not quite so on board as they used to be. We should talk about that sometime. Rowan kept her voice level. What do you want? Clark slapped her forehead with feigned epiphany. Of course! I bet you're worried about Behemoth, aren't you? What a waste spending all those billions on this cozy little quarantine, and all of a sudden here's Patient Zero taking a shit on the upholstery. What do you want? Clark stepped forward. Rowan didn't budge. I want to talk to my mother, the Rifter said softly. Your mother's dead. Well, that depends on your definition. Clark steepled her fingers, considering. Genetically, yes, my mother's dead. But someone made me, I think. Remade me. Someone took what I had and replaced it with something else. Her voice hardened. Somebody twisted me around and built me to their own specs and fucked up pretty much every step of the way. And after all, that's what parents do, isn't it? Yes. Yes, it is. That's her thoughts. So, anyway, Clark continued, I've been on this, well, sort of a pilgrimage, I guess you'd call it. I've been looking for some answers from the person that really abused me all those years. I figured she'd have to be some kind of monster to do that. Big, mean, scary. Big and mean and scary. But you're not. You're hiding, Mom. The world's going to hell, and here you are, cringing and cowering and pissing your pants while the rest of us try and deal with the mess you made. Don't you dare, Rowan snapped. You arrogant pipsqueak, don't you fucking dare! Clark looked back with the faintest trace of a smile on her lip. You want to know who made this mess? Who made the mess? Rowan asked. We tried to contain Behemoth. We did everything possible. We tried to wipe it off the face of the earth before it ever got out. And who was fighting us every step of the way? Who let it out, Clark? Who was spreading apocalypse every time she turned around? Who was so hell-bent on her self-righteous crusade she didn't care who suffered? I'm not the angel of death. You are. I tried to save the world. By killing me. By killing my friends. Your friends? Your friends? Rowan fought a giddy urge to laugh. You blind, stupid little bitch! We took millions in collateral damage, do you understand? The refugees, the firestorms. I can't begin to count the people we killed to save the world from you. Did you even stop to think about the people who helped you? Do you know how many innocent fools got caught up in the myth, were falling over themselves to take a bullet for the great Lenny Clark? And, you know, some of them got their wish. And the rest, well, they're just as royally fucked by your grand crusade as anyone else. She sucked in breath through clenched teeth. And you won. Clark, are you happy? You won. We did everything we could to stop you, and somehow it still wasn't enough. And now we've got our families to think of. We can't save the world, but at least we can save our own flesh and blood. And if you try to stop me from doing that, I swear I'll kill you with my bare hands. Her eyes were stinging. Her face was wet. She didn't care. The Rifter watched expressionlessly for a while. You're welcome to it, she said at last. Welcome to your kids, to your life, this little hidey hole you've burrowed out for yourselves. Keep it. You're safe. I'm not even a vector anymore. What? Don't you care about your revenge? Isn't that what all this is about? Don't you want to drag us back to the surface, kicking and screaming, to face the music? Clark actually smiled a bit at that. No need. You've already got a full orchestra down here. She shrugged. You know, I owe you in a way. If it hadn't been for you, I'd be just another drone in 9 billion. Then you and your cronies came along and turned me into something that changed the world. She smiled again, a faint, cold whisper of amusement. Proud of me? Rowan ignored the jibe. So why are you here? Just a messenger, Clark said, telling you not to worry. You want to stay here? That's just fine. And? And don't ever try to come back. Rowan shook her head. Coming back was never part of the plan. You could have saved yourself the trip. Your plans'll change the moment the situation does, the Rifter said. We're fighting for our lives up there, Rowan. We'd have stood a better chance if you C&C types hadn't got in and subverted the algorithm. You may have killed us already, but we could win. They say anemone's a hellaciously powerful computing system, if only we could tame it. Right, anemone. Rowan wiped her face. You know, I'm still not convinced it even exists. Sounds too much like pseudo-mystical wish fulfillment to me, like Gaia or the Force. Clark shrugged. If you say so. She's never even heard of them, Rowan thought. Her past is irrelevant, her future's non-existent, her present is hell on earth. And how do you expect a gang of electronic wildlife to get your biosphere back? She said. Not my department. That shrug again. But they say we're its natural environment somehow. It depends on us for survival. Maybe, if we can make it realize that, it'll protect us. Only if it's smarter than we were. Rowan managed a grim smile. Praise be to an enemy. Will you be erecting shrines? You'll never know, Clark said, because there's no room for you up there if we win. You won't win, Rowan said. Then there won't be room for us either. Doesn't change your situation any. Sure it does. She knows where we are. Others must know. Even if she leaves us alone, how many others might want their piece of retribution? I know I would. Rowan stared at the woman in front of her. On the outside, Lenny Clark was small. A skinny little girl. Nowhere near as big and mean and scary as she was inside. Who are you speaking for, Miss Clark? Are you just signing off on us personally, or are you presuming to speak for the whole world? I'm speaking for the Union, said the mermaid. The Union. The ones watching you. Me and Ken and everyone else walking around with tubes in their chests after your great experiment went south. The Union. It's an old Twensen word. Thought you might recognize it. Rowan shook her head. Even now I underestimate her. So you're just going to stand guard out there? Clark nodded. To make sure the old dangerous infection doesn't get out into the world again? A smile, a tilt of the head, saluting the metaphor. How long? 6 months? 10 years? As long as it takes. Don't worry, we can manage. We'll do it in shifts. Shifts. You made a lot of us, Pat. Maybe you lost count. And maybe we've got a pretty narrow damn it. You made a lot of us, Pat. Maybe you lost count. And we've got a pretty narrow band skill set. There aren't a whole lot of other things for us to do, anyway. I'm sorry, Rowan blurted out. Don't be. Lenny Clark turned to the viewport and leaned forward. Her eyes shone, blank but not empty. One hand reached up and touched the darkness. We were born to this place, she said. And that was Maelstrom by Peter Watts. Sequel to Starfish by Peter Watts. Second in the Rifter trilogy. Rifters trilogy? Whatever. All right, wait, no, that wasn't it. I lied. There's actually an epilogue. Whoops. Give me a sec. Epilogue. Sleeping by Firelight. The soft, muffled sounds filtering from the office are not English. They're barely even human. Martin Perot follows them across the threshold to whatever remains of his wife. She hasn't allowed him in here for months. At first, she was merely impatient at his presence, accusing him of all manner of trivial distraction. Later, she would shout at every intrusion, push him away with hands and words, and even, occasionally, thrown objects. "Can't you see it all coming apart?" she raged then. "Can't you see past your own lousy spectrum? Can't you see she needs help?" Finally, after the people had arrived at the door with their glittering contacts and their quiet, relentless words and that small, softly humming pacification fly hovering at their shoulders, just in case, finally Su-Han lost even the pretense of official sanction. She never saw them coming. The dart was in her neck before she'd even turned in her chair. When she woke again, her office was half gutted, every motor nerve torn out, every voice channel squelched at source, every breath of influence she'd ever had lost. It was like being paralyzed from the neck down, she said. She blamed him. He'd let them in. He hadn't protected her. He had collaborated. Martin didn't argue. It was all true. What scared him most at that point was not the accusations and the recriminations, but the flat and affectless voice in which Su-Han made them. The woman who had screamed at him had somehow been submerged. The thing that spoke in her place might have been made of liquid nitrogen. It withdrew to what remained of its office, and it said in matter-of-fact tones that it would kill Martin Perot if he ever went in there again, and it calmly closed the door in his face. No charges have been pressed. The people with the glittering eyes spoke understandingly of Su-Han's recent trauma, of her current distraught and muddled state. She had been used by others, they said. Many had been. Many had been. She was as much victim as offender. No need to punish the poor woman. Better that she should get help, now that she was no longer a danger to others. Martin Perot doesn't know if he believes that. Mercy is not something he's come to expect from such people. He thinks it more likely that the rumors are true, that the resources simply don't exist to prosecute Su-Han and her fellow criminals. She is legion. Perhaps that is also why the people with the glittering eyes settled for mere paralysis. They could have blinded and deafened They could have blinded and deafened Martin's wife as well, but cutting those nerves would have taken 15 minutes instead of 5. Perhaps they can't spare even that much time. Perhaps there are so many subversives that the system has to run as fast as it can to keep them merely hamstrung. Besides, Su-Han Perot can no longer affect events in the real world. What harm can she do by watching? Now she's not even doing that. She's curled up on the floor, making soft mewing noises. Her displaced headset lies halfway across the room. She doesn't seem aware that she's lost it. She doesn't seem aware of Martin's presence. He strokes her face, murmurs her name, flinches in anticipation of violence or sudden disdain. None comes. She doesn't react at all. He kneels, slips his arms beneath her legs and around her shoulders. She barely seems to weigh anything. She shifts in his arms as he lifts, buries her face in his chest. Still she doesn't speak. After he tucks her into bed, he returns to her office. Suhan's discarded headset spills a diffuse tangle of shifting light across the carpet. Sliding the hardware onto his own skull, he comes face to face with a SATCAM view of Western Enum. It seems strangely opaque, the hemispheres in darkness, none of the usual enhancements brightening the view. City clusters sparkle up from SoCal and the Queen Charlottes like galactic cores. The Midwest is a diffuse glow of underlit clouds. The Dust Belt intrudes from the east like a dark tumor. All features crude and raw, a naked eye view unbolstered by radar or infrared. Not like Suhan at all, to restrict her sensory window this way. The only tactical enhancements are some sort of timer running off to one side, and a bright overlay a few 100 kilometers east of the Pacific, a sparkling orange line paralleling the coast from SoCal up to BC. Even that lacks the precise delineation of most computer graphics. The line seems fuzzy, even broken in places. Martin zooms on the view, zooms again. Resolution and brightness increase. The orange line swells and sparkles and writhes. It is not an overlay. Plus 56 hours, 14 minutes, 23 seconds. Actually, it's plus 56H14M23S, but we'll just translate that. 56 hours, 14 minutes, 23 seconds, the timer says, incrementing before his eyes. It doesn't make any sense. How could any fire burn so brightly for so long? Surely the flames have consumed everything by now, reduced all combustibles to ash and everything else to slag. Yet somehow it keeps going, as if in defiance of physics itself. There, along the eastern boundary, a patch of relative darkness where the flames seem to be burning out. Martin watches it spread with a kind of dumb relief until the swollen black torus of a heavy lifter passes between earth and sky. To the SATCAM, it looks like the shadow of Mercury crossing a sunspot, but even at this range, there's no mistaking the bright trail it spreads behind it. The dying flames leap high in its wake, forcibly resurrected. They're not letting it die, he realizes. The fire burns on endless life support, from Oakland to Kitimat, and Martin Perot knows with sudden, dull certainty that a course has been set for it to follow. East. He leaves the office for a few moments, returning with a toolbox from his hobby room. He unlatches every access panel he can, smashes open the rest. He calmly dismembers each and every piece of equipment remaining in the room, cutting fiber op, pouring acid into computational organics, smashing crystals with a pneumatic hammer. Then he pads down the hall to the bedroom. Suhan is asleep at last, curled into a fetal ball. He cocoons her from behind, wrapping her flesh in his, and stares off into darkness while the real world falls asleep around him. And that is actually the end of Maelstrom. Sorry about that. That was not me pulling some elaborate, half-witted prank, sophomoric as it might have been. I honestly didn't look at the next page, and I honestly forgot. So, to wrap up, we do have acknowledgments and references. We'll do those. So that was Peter Watts's Maelstrom. So, that's great. You may be thinking, wow, that's kind of a downer ending.
You'd be right. It really is.
But that's how Peter Watts kinda do. He is not what I would call a shining beacon of apparent optimism. However, he is in fact an optimist. He just, that's why he seems to be kind of angry all the time. Because he knows we can do better. He believes we can do better, but we just refuse to do better. So he's just like infuriated constantly, and I believe it. As someone once put it, oh gosh, it's so good. I think it's Peter Watts is an angry sentient tumor. Peter Watts relishes his bad reviews, by the way. He does not necessarily let those go. He keeps an eye out. He likes them, or at least knows they exist, which you would do. His blog is moderately fascinating. There hasn't been much there lately. There's actually somebody convinced him to release a book collecting a certain number of his blog posts from way back. So he did it because money, why not? Do you really think that people are gonna want to listen to this? Just read this shit? And he's like, I mean, people do. people actually do read your freaking blog, dude. He's like, I mean, okay, but like, it's out there. It's good actually. It's there are some really. It's also got some short stories in it, so it's pretty nice. It's pretty good. I can't remember its title off the very tippy top of my head at the moment, but you can always go onto his website and just read his blog and do that. I have a link there to rifters.com. You can find everything. I've got a link to this very book that we've just finished reading, so you can read it there. It's there on his website for free. You can download it as a PDF. It's yours. Ta-da! Like, I have it there in the stream description on YouTube. Just do it. You'll also see all the horrible, horrible flubs I made. You can see it in real time. Why not? Yeah. Okay, so acknowledgements. Thanks first for the forbearance to Mike Brander, one of the nicest guys you could hope to meet, for not suing me after I inadvertently used his name in the last book. Thanks next for the help. Laurie Channer, Nalo Hopkinson, Brent Hayward, and Bob Boychuk all poked and prodded an embryonic stage of the first few chapters. Laurie also endured my endless stream of consciousness ramblings as I tried to fit all the pieces together. Hopefully her sacrifice has spared the rest of you from a similar fate. My agent, Don Maas, made a vital criticism of opening chapters which resulted in a whole new plot thread, and hopefully less straining for effect. David Hartwell edited with his usual renowned acumen, even if he did force me to cut the exploding daddy scene. And if you've been paying attention, you could probably guess where that was. I also got diverse technical assistance from other folks with postgraduate degrees like mine, the difference being that theirs were in subjects that actually proved to be good for something. Come on, dude. Marine biology, that's being a little harsh on himself and marine biology in general, but actually, if you read that book of his collected blog posts, you get a pretty interesting view on what his past career has been like. Also, that one time he got necrotizing fasciitis and almost died. Wild. Also, that time that he was captured by border police, U.S. border police, who beat the shit out of him and locked him up for a while because he said, no, I don't want to leave my car. Why do you need to look in the trunk of my car? That was resisting arrest. And, well, he's not allowed into the country, by the way. Into the U.S. He's not. Like, he's on the same list that Cat Stevens got on, basically. Among others. Among so many others. Post 9/11 United States. Please change. For the better? For the better. I should have really had that clarifier. Please change for the better. ASAP. Soonest. It would be real nice. Anyway. Actually, that might have been pre 9/11. I don't know. I'd have to find out. I'd have to research the timeline on that. Anyway, let me finish this acknowledgements. Mhm. I also got diverse technical assistance from other folks with postgraduate degrees like mine, the difference being that theirs were in subjects that actually proved to be good for something. Professor Dennis Lynn of the University of Guelph provided not answers, but questions and lines of inquiry for me to pursue. It's been 20 years since I took a course from the man, and he's still forcing me to think for myself. He also donated a copy of Lodish et al.'s Molecular Cell Biology to the cause, a text which easily outweighs the yellow pages for the GTA. Oh my god. Isaac Buckaroo Bonsai Spindle, an MD, neurologist, SF writer, screenwriter, and, no shit, electrical engineer, helped me out with the chemistry of guilt and suggested plausible field strengths for Rifter implants. He also kept me from slipping into steroid psychosis during a massive poison ivy infection while I was writing this book. Doctors Allison Sinclair and Fran Terry offered insights, suggestions, and/or overheads on matters microbial. Colin Bamsey told me what kind of alpine trees would be likely to survive the Great Warming, as in global warming. Given a world in which Quebec has become the predominant economic power, I figured various Quebecisms would have worked their way into casual Enum conversation. Hence all those italicized expletives that left most of you scratching your heads. For a crash course in how to be foul-mouthed in Canada's other official language, I thank Joel Champetier, Glenn Grant, Danielle Cernin, and Jean-Louis Trudel, even though they couldn't come up with an alliterative translation for blood-spewing, semen-sucking, sickle-celled savior. They did, however, dissuade me from turning Celine Dion into a swear word. Just barely. Almost wish Celine Dion were a swear word. That would have been hilarious. Also, maybe a bit too crass. Once again, the music of Ian Anderson and the inestimable Jethro Tull kept me company during the many long nights it took to lay this puppy to rest. And that's how you know he's a good person, because he likes Jethro Tull and Ian Anderson. I'm just saying, I've never met someone who liked Jethro Tull I didn't like. Okay? Okay. As did the music of REM, from whom I stole a couple of chapter titles. My thanks to all of these for their efforts and/or inspiration, and my apologies for all the stuff I probably got wrong anyway. REM, on the other hand, while I actually do essentially like the group, I have met people I didn't like who did like REM. That is different. That is them. They're fine. I really should start doing like a music one of these. I did the Frank Zappa one back last April as an April Fool's Day joke, and I was like, man, I really enjoyed that. Like, why don't I just make this a thing? If Mecha Mondays ever has to go anywhere, that's what it's getting replaced with is Music Mondays, and I'll basically just, I don't know, I'll find music biographies and stuff and read them as just use that as an excuse. The one for Warren Zevon, is that Excitable Boy? I read my uncle loaned that to me. He's a big Warren Zevon head. Um, he introduced me to Warren Zevon. Like everybody's heard Werewolf in London because that actually made the radio. But Warren Zevon's, I am really getting sidetracked. We haven't even finished the references. Anyway, I would love to read that book aloud. You too can learn how Warren Zevon, while a fairly brilliant musician, actually was a horrible person, and how you can completely solo act fuck up your entire life. One man wrecking crew for his own life, but also still be also kind of turn it around at the end, at the very bitter end. So yeah, it is reading like music biography. Like another, what's his name? God, Chuck Klosterman. Yes, Chuck Klosterman. I could definitely stand to read some of his books aloud, like Sex, Drugs, and Cocoa Puffs. I don't know where my copy of that is, actually. It's not on my wall. Is it? Maybe it's buried behind whatever. We're not talking about that. References. References. Let's move on. Sorry, everyone who doesn't like hearing the side commentary. Because we live in a linear, three-dimensional space-time with causality begetting... Wait. Causation begetting causality? How does that work? Yeah. Causation begetting causality? Something like that. In any case, because we live in a linear space-time, three-dimensional space-time, I can't have side commentary. I can only have commentary in the middle of things. So, when you can figure out, when somebody figures out how to talk four-dimensionally, please hit this guy up. Of course, the YouTube compression algorithm will fuck it up mercilessly, but it's YouTube. I made a great joke at the expense of the the fangs, F-A-A-N-Gs. Booyah! Fight me, corporate overlords. References. Let me get another slug of water here. The following references helped me beat Maelstrom into a shape that's, hopefully, more plausible than if I'd just made everything up myself. This is in addition to the references I cited 2 years ago in Starfish, which I won't bother repeating here. Go buy the damn book if you're so interested. Give me more authors that just straight talk you and are like, yeah, you know what? I put this entire trilogy up on my website on the Creative Commons license. You can just read it for free. I don't give a fuck. Or just go out and buy the fucking book, asshole. Do you care about the references? Just read the book. Behemoth. When I started writing this book, strange claims had just started surfacing in the scientific literature. A new kind of extremely primitive microbe freshly discovered, something inconceivably small. Footnote number 1. I'm not going to tell you what they actually are. I'm not going to read you the reference because that involves flipping between pages, and we're not doing that. Suffice it to say, that one is novel nanoorganisms from Australian sandstones from American mineralogist from 1998. He said, so small, in fact, less than 100 nanometers in some cases, that many argued they couldn't possibly be alive. Believers dubbed them nanobes. Formal taxonomy, Nanobacterium sanguineum, has been suggested, but not yet formally adopted. Now, a couple of years later, nanobes have been found not only in hot springs and Triassic sandstone, but in the blood of mammals, including humans. Evidently, they find us comfortably reminiscent of the primordial soup in which life originally evolved some 3.5 billion years ago. They feed off the phosphorus and calcium in our blood. Oh, I haven't been listing the numbers of footnotes. How many are there? I'll give you the total at the end. How about that? Behemoth is not N-sanguineum, of course. N-sanguineum? I'm saying N-sanguineum. No, it's sanguineum. Yep. N, as in nanobacterium, sanguineum. Behemoth is not N-sanguineum, of course. It's more sophisticated in some ways, more primitive in others. Its genome is encoded in pRNA, not DNA. It snarfs sulfur, not phosphorus and calcium. It can't survive in cold saline environments. Real nanobes probably can't metabolize under such conditions either, but they can withstand them in a dormant state. It has advanced adaptations for cell penetration that are way out of nanobacterium's league. It's large as conventional mycoplasmas and marine bacterioplankton. It is also much nastier, and, last but not least, it doesn't actually exist. I have, however, tried to make this bug reasonably plausible, given the dramatic constraint of a global apocalypse in a crunchy coating. As a result, Behemoth is like one of those composite serial killers you read about in true crime books. Bits and pieces of various real-world bugs thrown together with lots of dramatic license. A51 really exists, both in deep lake sediments and the human mouth. Pseudomonas aeruginosa is another bacterium that lives quite happily in soil, water, worms, and people. Like Behemoth, it has genes that allow it to speed up and slow down its own rate of mutation so it can quick adapt to novel environments. I've called them Blackford genes, Blachford genes, here, in the hopes that one Alistair Blackford will get off his ass and publish his thesis on genetic metavariation as an evolutionary strategy. Doesn't that kind of imply that it's, well, no, it doesn't imply that it's premeditated, just that it works. Whatever. That it functions, and yeah. March and McMahon's 1999 review of receptor-mediated endocytosis told me how Behemoth would be most likely to get inside a host cell, and Decatur and Portnoy, of Dream Theater fame, told me how it could avoid getting digested afterward. He really is a Renaissance man. And once again, a nod to Dennis Lynn of the University of Guelph for forcing me to worry about such things in the first place. Behemoth's genetics are cadged from a variety of sources, many of which I quoted without really understanding. The stuff on mitochondria and pyranosal RNA comes from Eschenmoser, Geschteland et al., Gray et al., and Orgel. Behemoth's size and genome are consistent with theoretical size limits for microorganisms, and big enough to sustain a normal microbial metabolic rate. Real nanobes are too small to contain many enzymes, which means that many of their metabolic pathways crawl along at uncatalyzed speeds. They therefore metabolize about 10,000 times slower than bacteria such as E. coli, which makes them pretty poor candidates for outcompeting a whole biosphere. And of course, it's looking more and more likely that life itself began as a sulfur-dependent phenomenon in a hydrothermal rift vent. That would be footnote 16. I cobbled other bits and pieces from Lodesh et al.'s Molecular Cell Biology. Why did I choose something as mind-bogglingly common as sulfur for a bottleneck element? I was trying to make a point about carrying capacity in ecological systems. Life is greedy, and if you give it long enough, anything can become limiting. Besides, any primitive microbe from a hydrothermal environment is likely to have a serious sulfur dependency problem. The specialists in the audience will notice that I carefully avoided making Behemoth an obligate sulfur reducer. I actually envisioned the little mother's metabolism as being more akin to that of the giant sulfide-consuming microbes reported by Schultz et al. Bottom line, most of Behemoth's traits have real-world precedence. Whether evolution could actually pack all those attributes into a package 250 nanometers across is a whole different issue, of course. Still, look at all the stuff that fits into Batman's utility belt. Guilt trip. The idea of behavior modification technology is old stuff in fiction. Burgess's A Clockwork Orange is an obvious example. In Maelstrom, I've taken a stab at rediscovering that wheel by explicitly tweaking genes and neurochemistry. As far as I know, the existence of the Minsky receptors that Alice Jovellanos mentions has yet to be confirmed. Something like them, however, must be seated in the frontal cortex where human conscience and morality, such as they are, reside. At the very least, certain types of frontal lobe damage have a tendency to turn good, God-fearing folk into sociopaths. I imagine that Ken Lubin's murder reflex is wired into the neural circuitry described by R. Davidson et al. The conceit of using tweaked parasite genes to program such behavior came to me when I was teaching an undergraduate course in animal ecology. The parasites mentioned in Maelstrom are real and have a lot of company. One fly-eating fungus hijacks its victim's nervous system just before killing it, forcing it to fly to an upside-down perch and orient its abdomen at an optimum angle for spore dispersal. An ant fluke called Dicrocoelium, wouldn't that be celium? Dicrocoelium, takes control of its host each night, riding it to the top of a convenient stalk of grass and freezing it there until morning, in hopes that some other hapless host will eat it. And yes, toxoplasma really does cause rats to lose their fear of cats, and in some cases actually to be attracted to the smell of cat urine. It is also found in about half the members of our species. This stuff is straight out of the puppet masters, folks. There's even a substantial amount of evidence to suggest that sex itself evolved primarily as a countermeasure against parasite attacks. Which is incidentally footnote 24. John Rennie J. January 1992. Living Together, Scientific American. Look it up. Anemone/Maelstrom. First, the wilderness with a capital W. The internet is already more like a wildlife habitat than you might expect. This is, by the way, back in the distant future year of 2001, I believe is when this was published. Yeah, if you think things haven't gotten wild out there, y'all aren't paying attention. There was somebody who was recently having an argument with someone else in a discussion I was part of, and used Chat GPT responses as proof of their argument. Well, tried initially, and then they were like, well, this doesn't actually prove it, but hey, look at the crazy chatbot. And I was like, please don't even pretend to do that as like a don't even try to set that precedent, because you know some people are dumb enough to do it. You just fucking know it. You just know in your bones that people will start doing that and earnestly believe that it's doing something like thinking. It's not, okay? That's a discussion for an entirely another stream. I mean, like, that's 100% relevant to this book. 100%. But we're not... The weeds. The reeds, I'm in them. I can't see. Oh, there it is. The internet is already more like a wildlife habitat than you might expect. Internet storms were first described in 1997, which makes them old news. Nowadays, you can link to weather maps of internet meteorology, updated several times daily. What was that one called? Norse, I think? If they're still around or haven't been bought by some other corporate concern, you could basically see a live action map of all these cyber attacks occurring, and sometimes where they were coming from. Not always, because proxies, I mean, you didn't know for sure that that's where they were actually coming from anyway, so proxies are fun. Mostly you could see destinations and who was getting shellacked. So you could see the meteorology, as it were. Once again, my far-flung futuristic foresight has proven wonderfully adept at predicting the past. The last time was when Starfish predicted submarine eco-tours to deep-sea rifts within 50 years, only to have such tours advertised in the real world by 1999. Those of you who have taken an undergraduate physiology course may remember the power law. It's a surface area to volume relationship that governs living systems from whole food webs right down to the capillaries of shrews. Essentially, a pattern typical of self-organizing, i.e. biological, systems. As it turns out, the World Wide Web itself appears to be evolving in concordance with this law. Something to think about. Second, the wildlife. These days, it's hardly necessary to cite references on the subject of artificial life. A web search on the phrase, or on cellular automata, will demonstrate how massively the field has exploded over the past 10 years. That subset of e-life goes by the name anemone. Is admittedly a bit more speculative and based upon two premises. The first is that simple systems, in aggregate, display emergent behaviors beyond the capability of their individual parts. This is pretty much self-evident within a body. Who'd deny that a brain is smarter than an individual neuron, for example? But the principle extends even to aggregations of completely unconnected individuals. A school of fish or a flock of birds can be thought of, in effect, as a diffuse neural net. There was actually, I can't say it's a recent article because it's from a couple years back, but it was kind of a study published on how the internet itself is evolving, basically with the idea of being, in the sense of cogs within the machine, smaller portions of it, things that make it go, being part of its overall organized thing, things that run through its channels, its capillaries, as it were, and that'd be us. That'd be us. We are part of that greater organized system. Was kind of the basic end gist. A related premise is that lineages with genetically determined behavior would be able to pass a Turing test if they evolved fast enough. This won't be hard to swallow for anyone familiar with how sophisticated such behavior can be. We do, after all, live in a world where ants practice animal husbandry, birds follow orthodome routes to navigate halfway around the world, and honeybees convey sophisticated travel instructions by wiggling their asses at each other. Skeptics might want to read any of E.O. Wilson's books on sociobiology, or an old Scientific American article by John Holland. It's way out of date, but it clearly conveys the principles behind genetic algorithms. Finally, anyone who treats the phrase group selection as an obscenity, I admit they're right most of the time, might first want to check out D.S. Wilson's review article of the subject in Skeptic. Smart gels. Research on the construction of thinking meat has proceeded apace since Starfish came out. Recent research is thumbnailed in Neurons and Silicon Get Intimate by Robert, no, not that Robert, Service. More conventional neural nets are literally in the driver's seat. Carnegie Mellon's Alvin program, which I mentioned briefly in the references to Starfish, has now moved onto the highway, where neural nets have autonomously taken 90-mile jaunts on public highways at speeds up to 70 miles per hour. They learn to drive by watching people at the same task. It took them less than 5 minutes. We still can't be sure exactly what neural nets actually learn when we train them. Paradigm cock-ups of the sort that made my head cheeses betray their masters have happened in real life. One infamous military neural net taught itself to distinguish between various ambient light conditions, while all along its humans thought they were teaching it to recognize tanks. Whoops. Probably because they started a slideshow or something and they turned the lights off or something. It was like, it's dark. Tanks! I see the tank. Is there a tank here? Yup. Gansfeld interrogation. Back in Starfish, I cited Roger Penrose's quantum consciousness theory to justify the rudimentary psi powers of the Rifters. Here in Maelstrom, Lubin uses the same trick to interrogate Achilles Desjardins. In the interest of full disclosure, I should admit that Penrose's theory has come under serious attack from a guy called Tegmark. The quantum mind aficionados have rallied, but things may be looking a bit iffier on the quantum consciousness front these days. What can you do? Haunted by happiness. Lenny Clark's hallucinations are loosely based on Bonnet's syndrome, a malady that sometimes results from macular degeneration. The brain really does compensate for loss of visual input by inserting images from visual memory into the gaps. In real life, Bonnet's syndrome tends to occur in elderly patients and is frequently associated with bereavement. The hallucinations are more or less seamlessly incorporated into the visual environment, as opposed to the picture-in-picture format Lenny experienced. Finally, if you want a more luminous taste of all this stuff, check out www.rifters.com. And that, finally, at long last, is Maelstrom by Peter Watts. So that's done.
Check one off the list. Ching!
Next is Authority by Jeff Vandermeer, and I'm sure some people were wondering while listening or reading Annihilation. So there's an entire organization dedicated to sussing out, an entire government organization dedicated to sussing out and finding answers about this thing. Wow, kind of wonder what life there would be like. You're gonna find out. Oh, you're gonna find out. And it's maybe not quite what you're expecting, but also maybe exactly what you're expecting. It's sort of both. It'll make sense when we get there. Oh, I never switched to the. Whatever. We'll use this other picture of Achilles Desjardins being Achilles. We'll do him. Oh, geez, I'm gonna have to do that like halfway through the book. I can't do it right early on, can I? I can't. I really can't. You have to learn about. You have to learn more about what he becomes. Oh, do you really think that there's going to be any kind of repercussions for what Alice Jovellanos did? Repercussions for making a bunch of people with their fingers on the buttons of what makes the world friggin' livable and makes it so that they're now clinical sociopaths? Because they can literally, physically no longer feel guilt? Nah, there's actually no repercussions whatsoever. It was that little mic drop, and that's literally it. Yeah, not a single. I lie through my teeth. There are repercussions. There are absolutely repercussions, and they're why I have that little disclaimer on this one, and it's going to be trebly true for the next book. Well, at least the parts of it that involve certain characters. It's whee. If you're at all squeamish about certain kinds of behavior, yeesh, makes me really wonder. Well, hey, I guess I figure if I can get away with this, don't say it. If I can get away with this, this opens the door to a few other things. What's his name? Not Brandon Sanderson. Come on, it's not Brandon. Ignore me. Can I actually see that from here? Can I? Oh, it's just out of. I need my glasses. Where are you? Oh no, that's not it. Where are you? No, seriously, where is it? Where are they all? Oh, I can, I can almost, almost make it out. Stephen R. Donaldson. There we go. And it is called. I don't know what the series is called. It's 5 books. I'd love to get to it because once you get past the first book, it's an extremely good space opera in the literal operatic sense of the word, not with singing, but in that it's literally the ring cycle in space. It's fantastic. It's great. It's really good. It's fairly dark, and the first book, while short, is what's a nice way to put this? Glorified torture porn, probably. It's really deeply unpleasant. There's some deep unpleasantness, but you kind of have to get through it in order to get to the good bits. But that one is kind of a sticking point. It's like, okay, it's a specific and literal case of I told you that story so I could tell you this one, and this one is 4 books long, whereas that one is like I don't know, 300 pages, give or take. I don't know how long it is. It's pretty long. It's not very long. Um,
Anyway, it's pretty good. There's a series. I remember reading one of the books in this other series that Stephen R. Donaldson did about this guy. Uh, oh, jeez, it's also quite dark. Where yeah, that's right. He's got leprosy, um, and he's confronted on like a constant basis with like actual miracles, and he's like, "Nah, I don't believe in it. I have leprosy. If there's miracles, why do I have leprosy?" And it's kind of about trying to find the answer to that particular question. And I think it's God is dicking with him is the answer. Is if memory serves. I don't remember. I don't remember. It's been so long. I should really look that up. Um, Anyway, so hope people dug Maelstrom by Peter Watts. Yeah, we didn't have an exploding daddy scene. Is that good? That's good, right? It's good. They died anyway. Sorry. They might have starved, but they probably died from Behemoth and then, got murdered to death by. Even if they hadn't, they would have been killed to death by the powers that be. Sorry. The little girl died. Claire, I think her name was. Claire, I want to say. Sad. But it's not exactly a happy setting. Then again, we don't exactly live in a happy setting ourselves, which is why you should do your best to stay safe, stay sane, be toasty or cool as based on your personal preference. If you've got a cat, the cat prefers toasty. Full stop. You will not find a cat that's like, yeah, no, I actually like it cold. It will snuggle at you, and that's not because it likes being cold, but because you have now made it necessary for it to find your body heat and be like, hey, I'm taking that. It's mine. You're warm. Give. You're literally just warm, squishy furniture. Please, please just do what you're supposed to do and exist for my gratification. Thank you. I love cats when they do that. That's great. I don't have Toxoplasma gondii. Definitely not. Definitely not. I probably do. I don't think I do. Cat pee does not smell great. Anyway, and be decent to each other. That's the important takeaway. Be decent to each other. That's all I ask. I had some other pithy rejoinder. Really pithy. Actually, nice and soft and pithy. So it's sort of like, nope, I forgot it. Doesn't matter. I'm not exactly the great orator of our age, let's say. Did people like Under Pressure, by the way? I really liked Under Pressure. I was thinking about that last night, in fact, while I was watching the old Buena Vista um, that's 56, I think. 50s or 60s. I think it's 50s. 1956 Buena Vista, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And it's gorgeous depictions of the inside of a Victorian era rust bucket Nautilus. God, I love the visuals in that movie. They have stuck with me since ever. Like ever since I saw that movie when I was a young impressionable youth, when I became an old impressionable not youth. Mm, cute flick. Parts of it have not aged well. But and there's some serious overacting. But I Kirk Douglas, come on. Peter Lorre, come on. Yes. Guy who plays Nemo, whose name I just forgot. Come on. It's great. It's great. The sets. Look at the sets. They have rivets everywhere. And where there aren't rivets, they've got that ornate Victorian era brasswork. Jules Verne. I need to get some Jules Verne up in this Tish. This is like Jules Verne is, oh man, kind of hard to read because he's old. Um, but man, like that's foundational stuff, and it's really pretty good. Yeah, he said the F word. He said foundational. You know what that means? Isaac Asimov, Power Hour. Let's go. I'm not doing it. I'm not doing it. We're done with the ramble. Okay. Wait, where's my Jules Verne collection? No, I don't know where I put that. It's around. I would not have gotten trust and believe.
Trust and believe. Frag would not get rid of his Jewel Verne collection. It just wouldn't happen. It's not in the cards. It's just not.
Could it be right next to my Philip K. Dick? It shouldn't be, but hey, that's not me making lewd comments. I love Dick. Philip K. Dick. It's a good book. Was a great author. He goes way off the deep end towards the end, but man, is he a good, damn, is he compelling. Like, very few people write outright paranoia as well as he did. Also, huge, I think I've said this before, huge props to his daughters for managing the estate, the Philip K. Dick estate, as well as they have. Uh, Given that there are other examples of not managing an estate well, um, they do a pretty good job. Whatever your opinions on Blade Runner happen to be, they do a fairly good job, or Minority Report. They do a fairly good job curating so that things remain essentially true in some key aspect to the source material, even if they do occasionally star Tom Cruise. Compare contrast with the E.E. Doc Smith estate, which less so. That isn't so much a case of that's kind of like an anti using the intellectual property. It's an example of, hey, so there was like one time when we let our intellectual property be used and we were like, I didn't really like that very much, so never again. Uh, it's sad. It's sad. So best you can do is hope to find published copies. I think actually a large number of them are on Project Gutenberg. I'm confident that Triplanetary is. I think some of the other early ones are as well. Maybe not Galactic Patrol, which is too bad. Galactic Patrol is great. Like Galactic Patrol, I through sheer happenstance read that series in like the optimum reading order by purest accident. Like you shouldn't read Triplanetary first, even though chronologically the events it catalogs are the ones from earliest on in the series, because it spoils literally the entire end game very early on. It's like, yeah, so you're probably wondering how does this whole thing happen? At the end with the kids, Kim, the kids. Think about the kids. Well, we're going to spoil the entirety of that, which I find very charming, but at the same time, I'm like, oh, thank goodness I didn't see that coming, because I would have been kind of bummed. Series I'd love to read aloud, but have already have been done by people who were kind of better at it than I am, but I might still take a stab at that. So I have now successfully rambled for 35 minutes, maybe more. Okay, so I'm going to leave you all alone. Thanks for tuning in. If you didn't tune in live, yo, I get it, bro. What bro that? I don't know. Could be either. We don't judge. Um, we don't. Well, we judge about some things, just not gender. It's the stupidest thing to judge someone on. Or race, I mean, if you come from okay. If you're a Bosconian or you're one of the wheelmen of Plur, I'm gonna judge you a little because I'm like, what's up with that? Why are you a space pirate of Boscone? Because you're kind of a head ass, bro. Kind of a jerk. Why are you? Like? Why do you have a giant drug ring going in space, bro? Stop it. Like, you're hurting lives. You're ruining livelihoods. Stop, please. Otherwise, though, go for it. I don't care.
It's your actions that define you. It's your actions. It's what you do. It's you are. You can think nice thoughts. That's why I say be decent to each other. Did somebody slip me a Mickey? Why am I like this today? I don't know. I'm in a good mood. Anyway, with that, if you aren't catching me live, totally okay. That's why it's on YouTube. If you do want to catch me live, I have the worst scheduled hours ever of noon Eastern Standard Time every single Friday. More or less noon Eastern Standard Time. Sometimes I'm late due to reasons. Anyway, with that, I bid thee adieu. And yeah, hope you all have fun. You know, enjoy life. Jeez. Unless you're a sadistic sociopath, then please don't enjoy life. You're not helping. Help people not to die. Help the world. Although that could entail getting rid of humanity. I'm torn on this one. I should really. Should I have thought about this more? I don't know. Is it really likely that that a a sadistic sociopath is listening to me read Maelstrom by Peter Watts, which is about, in no small part, enabling and the creation of a sadistic I have maybe made some grievous tactical errors. Alice Jovellanos, I'm beginning to understand. Jeez. Damn. How quickly we fall from grace. How quickly we submerge ourselves in the mid-Atlantic rift, building our glorious perspex domes, and watching as the rifters crawl in and harangue us and be like, hey, ma'am, me, ma'am, I'm not your mother. Actually, Patricia Rowan winds up being probably my favorite part about the last volume, about Behemoth, which is the title of the last book of the Rifters trilogy. She's like her. We've already had a lot of glimmerings and inklings to Patricia Rowan and how she kind of operates and feels about things, but seeing how that develops is very interesting. I will warn you when we eventually get to Behemoth Book 1, which is, I think, Beta Max is what it's called. There's a time skip, and a lot of really important things happen during the time skip, and we're kind of forced to deal with the status quo post time skip without a lot of preamble. So it's a bit of a doozy. It's very disorienting, but you kind of figure it out eventually. But yeah. So yeah, next week is, at this point, I'm assuming, Authority by Jeff Vandermeer. I have to get covers. I have to get cover images. I've got to do that. I should do that today. Yeah. Anyway, Jeff Vandermeer. Good stuff. Is he a great scientist? Probably not. Had a nice little comment thing with someone who was like, if you were an actual scientist, he would say these things. And I'm like, to be fair, a biologist is kind of a shitty scientist. Or at the very least is an incredibly unreliable narrator. Like that's like the entire point of her character, as you learn going through the first book, Annihilation, is she's a really, really unreliable narrator. And you sort of wonder, okay, maybe she did get a degree in marine biology or something, but who gave that out? How did she go through the scut work of making that happen? Because she can't really seem to be around people for any duration of time. I'm still rambling. It has been 41 minutes. I am calling it. Sorry. Goodbye. Thank you. I need to save you all from me. Is that how that works? We're doing it again. We're doing it. Was there caffeine in this? Jeez. I don't know, dude. See y'all later. Bye.